You can do all kinds of morally virtuous things out of a heart filled with fear, pride, and desire for power, or out of a heart that's been actually changed at the root by the grace of God. And so what we're doing is we're looking at the traits of a heart that's really been radically changed by the grace of God. Paul, in this passage, shows that the root cause for why we cannot get along, the root cause for why there's no peace in the world, why we can't live at peace with each other, is pride and boasting. See, verse 21 starts off, no more boasting. The last verse, chapter 4, verse 7, let's stop the boasting. And especially, let's not have pride, see verse 6, of one man over another. So we're at the trait of humility. And that means we get into a very, very culturally interesting subject, which is self-esteem. The traditional cultures have always believed that too high a view of yourself is the real root cause for most of the evil in the world. Most of the crime, the violence, the warlikeness. Why do people abuse? Why are people cruel? Why do people do the bad things they do? Traditionally, the answer was hubris, pride. Too high a view of yourself is the reason why we misbehave. But in the modern Western culture, we have an utterly opposite cultural consensus. The basis of our education, of the way in which we treat incarcerated prisoners, the basis of a lot of our legislation, certainly the basis of our counseling, our belief today, and it's deeply rooted in everything, is that people misbehave for lack of self-esteem, because they have too low a view of themselves. People with high self-esteem pose a greater threat to those around them than people with low self-esteem. And feeling bad about yourself is not the source of any of our country's biggest problems. What's intriguing about this passage is it gives us an approach to self-regard, an approach to self, a way of seeing yourself that is absolutely different than traditional cultures or modern, postmodern, contemporary culture. The three things we learn here is Paul shows us the natural condition of the human ego, and then the supernatural condition that can be brought about through the gospel, and lastly, how to get it. The natural condition of the human ego, the transformed sense of self and identity that Paul had discovered, and how to get it. First thing we learn is the natural state of the human self. He says, let's have no more pride. And this word for pride is a word that literally means to be overinflated, swollen, distended beyond its proper size. It evokes the image of some organ of the human body that is distended because so much air has been pumped into it that it's ready to burst. It's overinflated, it's distended, it's swollen, it's inflamed because it's been extended past its proper size. And that, he says, is the condition of the natural human ego. You know, what does the metaphor mean? What is he trying to say? And here are some things we learn. We learn, first of all, the natural condition of the human ego is to be empty, painful, busy, and fragile. First, empty. At the center of the human ego, no matter how big it is an emptiness. It is the normal state of the human heart to try to build its identity around something besides God. Spiritual pride is the illusion that you are competent to run your own life, achieve your own sense of self-worth, and find a purpose big enough to give you meaning in life without God. The normal human ego is built on something besides God, something that will give you worth, something that will give you a sense of specialness, something that will give you a sense of purpose. If you try to put anything in the middle of a place that was originally made for God, it's going to be too small, and it's going to rattle around in there, and therefore, the human ego in the beginning, first thing we learn is it's empty. And because it's empty, secondly, it's painful. What do I mean by that? Well, have you ever noticed that you don't notice your body unless there's something wrong with it? Parts of your body do not call attention to themselves unless there's something wrong with them. The ego has got something incredibly wrong with it. Yourself, your identity, has something unbelievably wrong with it because it's always drawing attention to itself every single day. How you look, how you were treated. People are always saying, my feelings were hurt. It's your ego that's hurt. Your feelings are fine. You're having bad feelings about your ego. You can't get through the day without feeling snubbed or feeling ignored or feeling stupid or getting down on yourself. There's something wrong with your identity. There's something wrong with your ego. There's something wrong with your sense of self because it's never happy. It's always drawing attention to itself. Thirdly, because it's empty and painful, the ego is incredibly busy trying to fill the emptiness. And it's incredibly busy doing two things in particular. And those two things are comparing and boasting. First of all, notice he doesn't say in verse 6, then you will not take pride. He says, then you will not take pride in one another over against another, in one man over against another. That's the very essence of what it means to have a normal human ego. The normal human ego is not only empty, but the way it tries to fill its emptiness and tries to deal with its discomfort is by comparing yourself to other people all the time. Pride is by nature competitive. Pride gets no pleasure out of having something, only having more of it than the next person. You may think you're proud of being successful or intelligent or good-looking, but you really aren't. You're only proud of being more successful, more intelligent, and more good-looking than other people. And when you are in the presence of people who are much more successful, intelligent, and good-looking than you lose all pleasure in what you had because you really had no pleasure in it. You were proud of it. Pride is the pleasure of having more than the next person. Pride is the pleasure of being more than the next person. And that is what your ego is doing all the time. You're in jobs that you take no pleasure in. You're doing diets that you take no pleasure in. You're doing all kinds of things that you are not doing for themselves, but you are by comparing yourself to other people. You're boasting. The word boasting here means to recommend yourself. It means you are creating a self-esteem resume desperate to fill the sense of inadequacy and emptiness. So busy all the time. And lastly, it's fragile. Because anything that is overinflated is imminently about to be deflated. People who seem to have no pride because they hate themselves and they tell you they hate themselves and they tell themselves they hate themselves are deflated. To be deflated means you were inflated. If you were puffed up by air and not filled up with something solid, then to be inflated, to be deflated is all the same thing. To have a superiority complex or an inferiority complex is just the same thing. They're both results of being overinflated, distended, empty, painful, busy, and of course, therefore fragile. That's the normal state of the human self. In verses 3 and 4, we have Paul giving us an example of how, now that he understands the gospel, how his own sense of self works, how his own self-regard operates, how his own identity works, and his own ego, in a sense, works. And here's what he does. First of all, he says, now, yes, I'm a minister, and I have a job to do, he says in verse 1 and 2. But with regard to it, he says, I care very little if I'm judged by you or by any human court. In other words, you see what he's saying? I don't care if I'm judged by you or by any human court. Now, the word judge is the word for verdict. And what he does is he looks out and he says, one thing I want you to know is I don't care what you think. I don't care what you think about me. I don't care what anybody thinks about me. He says, I have come to the place where my identity owes nothing to what people say. My identity, my self-regard is not tied in any way to your verdict and your evaluation of me. How do you get there? How do you get to the place where people think about you don't control you anymore? How do you get there? Now, almost everybody would say it's very obvious. You shouldn't be living according to what they say. You shouldn't be living according to their standards. It shouldn't matter what they think about you. What should only matter is what you think about you. It shouldn't matter what their standards are. It should only matter what your standards are. Choose your own standards. Decide who you want to be and then be it. Is that what Paul does? No. He says, I care very little if I'm judged by you or any human court. Indeed, I do not even judge myself. My conscience is clear, but that does not make me innocent. He will not fall into the trap of high self-esteem. He says he doesn't judge himself. Good, you shouldn't condemn yourself, but that's not what the word judge means. The word judge here means a verdict, whether positive or negative. And here's what he's saying. We know this. We know was a man with incredible ballast. He was one of the most influential leaders in the history of the human race. He had enormous ballast. He had incredible confidence. He moved ahead. Nothing fazed him. And yet he says in 1 Timothy, Jesus Christ came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am chief. Not I was chief. I am chief. How can somebody have incredible confidence and say I'm one of the worst people? How can somebody be absolutely honest and aware of all kinds of moral flaws yet have incredible poise and confidence? We can't do that. You know why? Because we're judging ourselves. And when Paul says, I don't let you judge me, I don't even judge me, here's what he means. He says, I know about my sins, but I don't connect them to me and my identity. They're not connected. I don't play that game. I don't see a sin and then say, bad job, so I'm bad. Good job, so I'm good. There's no connection. I see all kinds of sins, I see all kinds of accomplishments, and they do not connect. That's the reason why, I'm one of the chief of sinners. That's not going to stop me from doing the things that I'm called to do. And we do not know anything about that. All we know is if I thought I was a bad person, and I thought I was a sinner, if I thought I was filled with pride, and if I thought I was filled with lust, and I thought I was filled with anger and greed, and all the things that Paul says he's filled with, I wouldn't have any confidence. No, because you're judging yourself. You've set your standards, and now you're condemning yourself. Because the ego will never be satisfied that way. Never. And Paul is bringing us into new territory that we don't know anything about, because Paul's ego is not puffed up, it's filled up. He is saying, I have come to the place where my ego does not draw any more attention to itself than any other part of my body. I have come to the place where I'm not thinking about myself anymore. Because don't imagine if you met a really humble person, you would ever come away from him thinking he was humble. He will not be somebody who's always telling you he's a nobody, because see, that's actually a self-obsessed person. That's a person who's judging himself. Either up or down, doesn't matter. He says, all you will remember remember from coming away from a truly humble person is how much he seemed to be totally interested in you. Because the essence of gospel humility is not thinking more of yourself or thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. It's not needing to think about yourself. It's not needing to connect things. Every conversation, I'm in this room with these people. Does that make me look good? Do I want to be here? I stopped thinking about myself. The blessed rest of self-forgetfulness. An ego that's not puffed up but filled up. In a way, is this high self-esteem? No. Is this low self-esteem? No. You stop the game. And that's the secret. One mark of a truly humble person in this sense, a self-forgetful person, not a self-hating person, not a self-loving person so much, but a self-forgetful person. Here's one little test. On the one hand, it would never be hurt that badly by criticism. It would not be devastating. It would not bother you. It would not keep you up late. Why? Because a person who's devastated by criticism, you're putting too much stock in what other people think, other people's opinion. You either have people who are devastated by criticism, or they're not devastated by criticism, but they don't take it. They don't listen to it. They don't actually listen to it. They don't learn from it because they say, I don't care about it. The reason it doesn't devastate me is I know who I am. I know what I think. I know who I am. In other words, we do not know how to heal low self-esteem except with pride. And they are both horrible nuisances to your own future and to everybody around you. But a person who's self-forgetful, a person whose ego is not puffed up but filled up, when you get criticism, it wouldn't devastate you, but you'd listen to it. You'd say, oh, criticism, an opportunity to change. The closer you get to understanding the gospel, the more you'd be like that. Friends, wouldn't you want to be somebody who doesn't need honor and isn't afraid of it, doesn't lust for recognition, or on the other hand, be just frightened to death of it? Don't you want to be a kind of person who, when you go by a window or a mirror or something, you don't look in, you don't admire what you see, and you don't cringe either? Nor do you ever beat yourself up. Do you ever sit around saying, boy, I was stupid, I was wrong, how could I have done something like that? Wouldn't you like to be free? That's the possibility. If you keep on going where Paul's going, you could actually start to enjoy things. They're not about you. Your work's not about you. Your romance is not about you. You can actually enjoy things for what they are. They're not just for your resume. They're not just to look good on your application. They're not just a way of filling up the emptiness. This is gospel humility, blessed self-forgetfulness. Now, how do you get it? How did Paul get it? Well, he actually tells you. He says, number one, I don't care what you think. Number two, I don't care what I think. I don't look to you for the verdict, and I don't look to me for the verdict, even if my conscience is clear. That does not make me innocent. That's what the translation says. But the word is, that does not justify me. He says, what we're all looking for is an ultimate verdict that we're important and that we're valuable. And every time we think we've done it, it doesn't seem to be there. And what that means is the world, every single day, we go to trial. We're in a courtroom every day. You notice how Paul says, I don't care what you think about me or what any human court thinks. And what he's trying to say is the problem with self-esteem, high or low, the problem with the way almost everybody's normal identity works is that every single day you're in the courtroom, you're on trial, and there's prosecution and there's defense. And everything you do, you're stamping evidence for the prosecution, evidence for the defense. And some days you feel like you're winning the trial, and some days you feel like you're losing a trial. And Paul says, I have found the secret. The trial's over for me. I'm out of the courtroom. It's gone. It's over. Because the ultimate verdict is in. He says it very simple. You cannot justify me. I cannot justify myself. It is the Lord who judges me. His opinion only counts. And in Jesus Christ, and only in the gospel of Jesus Christ, do you get the verdict before the performance. In Christianity, the verdict leads to performance. The performance does not lead to the verdict. When the minute I believe, God says, you are my beloved in whom I'm well pleased, the verdict is in. Now, Romans chapter 8, verse 1, now there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. The verdict is in. And now I perform on the basis of the verdict. He loves me. He accepts me. Now I don't have to do things just to build up my resume. I don't have to do things to make me look good. I can do things to do things. I can help people to help people. Not so I can feel better about myself. Not so I can fill up the emptiness. Paul's out of the courtroom. Paul's out of the trial because Jesus went to trial. Because Jesus went into the courtroom. It was an unjust trial, and he was put to death. Why? As our substitute. He took the condemnation we deserved. He took the trial we deserve, so we don't have to have any more trial. So the minute I say, Lord, accept me because of what Jesus has done, then the only person's opinion who counts looks at me and finds me more valuable than all the jewels that are under the earth. You have to relive the gospel every time you pray, every time you come to church, and you have to relive the gospel on the spot. You have to say, what am I doing in this courtroom? Court is adjourned. I don't care what you think. I don't even care what I think. I only care what the Lord thinks. And he has said, you are my beloved child in whom I'm well pleased. Live out of that.